Isle, Weininger, Fosterville Centennial, which is going to last, as we hope, for about 2 years now. And this is the kickoff on the 20th of May, 2006. And we hope it's the beginning of a lot of get-togethers and parties and information about our history and the place we love so much. We have Jack Weininger with us today, who is the fourth
cousin, 3 times removed.
3 times removed cousin of the original William Weininger. And he's going to say a few words to us. He's up from Chicago, came up for this event, and he's with his family, and we hope that they will love it so much that they'll come back often. And then Paul Brenner is going to talk, and with his wealth of information, we could have a meeting with Paul every week from now to ever, and we still wouldn't exhaust his information on the history of this, yes, Paul, of this country. And we're very grateful to both of you for coming and for sharing this day with us. First, Jack Weininger.
Thank you. Thank you, Winnie. Thank you. First, I'd like to introduce my wife, Margaret, back there in the white shirt. That's Jordan up there with the camera, and that's his sister, Jennifer, next to her. Name is Jack Weininger. My grandfather pronounced it Winiger, but he didn't like the sound of it. And from my understanding, when William Weininger operated, that's the way he's pronounced it. But however you want to pronounce it, I don't care. I can call it a lot worse than that. He asked me to just say a couple quick words. When I was growing up, I had heard of Weininger, Wisconsin, and I just assumed it was an uncle. And I figured there was a Weininger, Wisconsin, and a Weininger, Michigan, because I heard that they logged in both areas. But I never find a Weininger, Michigan on the map. Then when I was in the Cub Scouts, for a project right before they changed the name to Presque Isle, I had the postmistress here in town send me some postmarks of Weininger. And I understand that the post office is going to have a centennial postmark sometime this summer. That's going to have the Weininger name back on it again. And that's all I knew. And then in 1999, there was a model train convention in Minneapolis. And I came up through Rhinelander and Boulder Junction. That's when I met Paul. And then I went to Viles County Museum, went to Lyona, came here, and that's when I started getting information. I stopped in your library. I got the Crab Lake Memories book when I was there. And ever since then, I've been putting different pieces of information together on the history of the mill, which is what interests me for my model train, which you can see over there, which is the type of engine that they would have used at the Viles County Lumber Company. They actually had 3 of them, the shade type geared engines, where you use a lot of logging companies to pull the logs out. And it just has grown, and everything I know about Weininger, Wisconsin is on that table. There's some pictures there. Anything that's loose, you're welcome to have. Those are just extra stuff when I was putting things together. Take with you if you're interested. I've collected a lot of postcards from Weininger, and I put them over there. A couple of them I was able to figure out, and if anybody else can help us figure out where a lot of those other old resorts were, feel free to move a pin off the postcard and put it on one of the lakes where it's at. Anyway, that's basically it. It's short. Does anybody have any questions? Good. Thank you.
Now, if we can turn these lights off, this will help show these pictures a little better. Now, I have 2 different logging talks. One deals with the logging before the railroads got here and shows the stuff, not only the cutting and slaying and stuff, but the log drives and stuff. But this one is after the railroads got here. Now, the railroads got both the Presque Isle and Winchester and Boulder about 1905, and so the date for any of this stuff would be roughly then and after. Now, if you have any questions, you can either ask right away or at the end of the talk, you can, I'll try to answer them for you. Now, when the companies would buy land like Weininger up here, of course he did mostly all railroad logging, but the original stuff, like within 5 miles, like of the Chippewa River, or in our case the Manitwish River, which is part of the Chippewa, within 10 miles they'd slay the logs down to the river and then dump them in there. So they had to have roads in the country, not so much to get them out of the woods, but to haul a long distance. And this is it's pretty hard to see, but there's sort of a dirt scoop right behind, in front of the man and behind the wheels. And he'd pull back the handles and get a load of dirt on it, and then the horses would take it up ahead, and then they'd dump it wherever they had a low spot to level things off. Because they wanted the roads as level as they can. Sometimes they even ran them across swamps and stuff where they laid corduroy and stuff. Because most of the logging originally before the railroads was done in the wintertime. Now on the main line into the woods, they had to have pretty big cuts once in a while, and so I'm not sure exactly where this cut is, but it was deeper than any of the other picture I saw, so I included how much. So they got a lot of dirt out here to pull ahead up to wherever the next spot was. Here's a fill on that same group of pictures, and apparently they had some, up in this country especially, it's quite hilly. Down in the Boulder country it isn't quite as hilly as that, so there was a lot of cuts and a lot of fills. Here's, they had, they laid rails, of course, and then these were rigs that they could haul gravel and dirt and stuff to make these cuts. Now, when they'd come to places that there was really a swampy area, they'd have to, you can see right in the front on the left that where they drive some posts down there that were fairly large, and then they lay these timbers that they got from the mill across these bad spots. And then, of course, eventually they had the road reasonably level and stuff, and then they lay ties and put the tracks on it. Here's a place where they were going across a swampy area again, and apparently they were filling on top of corduroy or something, dirt. And here's where they actually lay in ties. Once they had the mill going, they could make the ties themselves, and even after they had all their roads in, they made ties and they sold them to the bigger railroad companies, because about the time they were logging up in this area is when the railroads start crossing the prairies and stuff out west and going to the west coast, and there was a long area there that they didn't have much timber, and so if they didn't, so a lot of the stuff came from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and stuff, and so a lot of the mills, I'm not sure if Presque Isle mill had any except for their own, but would make timber ties for railroad cuts. A lot of places, especially like in Weininger stuff, they had a lot of places where they would move the camp. They'd have railroad cars that they used to sleep in and to keep the horses and dining car and stuff like that. And so there are a lot of places they just cut rough timber, and rather than making ties out of good logs and stuff, they'd just have timber, because they knew they'd only be using it for one or two seasons, and then they'd leave the ties there, but they'd take out the rails and stuff and move on to the next place. Here's where they got the ties down and they're beginning to put the rails down. I can't do too much with the pictures because it's a little light in here, but that's about as best we can do on it. Now here's a rig I found in one of the camps, and when the companies made their own, the big companies that made lines for like the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Northwestern, they had equipment that they could lay the rails the perfect distance apart, but a lot of the smaller companies, all they did was they had the blacksmith make a rig, and this is the only one I found, but it was just the right distance for standard gauge. Now, often they had, some of the companies had small gauge on their own. And the gauge is the distance between the rails, and some of the smaller companies would just have a small gauge railroad, but I think Weininger had big ones. Now this is just in my garden. I found a couple of sets of rails that were left over, and I use this. I've got a garden, and I got a lot of frames that I use for the peas and stuff to go up on, and I just took a picture and showed how it worked. Now here's again, it shows how they usually just use rough ties, and the rails were just getting up to here. Like I say, the pictures don't show up as well when it's light in here. Now occasionally they'd come to big gullies and stuff where they'd have pile drivers, and they'd put in piles, and then of course lay the tracks across it. Their whole reason, especially for their main lines, was to have a fairly level grade all the time. Now some of the back grades, they could back in and there'd be hills and stuff involved, but on the main line they went to a lot of work to get this stuff out. Now here's just a small gully and stuff that they went across that they put this stuff up. And here's one that they cut a lot of timber, probably it could have been hardwood or popple or who knows what, to build up to where they finally had the rails and stuff. Now this is a rig that, on some of the camps, they'd have a big Y in the rails. In other words, they'd have the main line going east and west, and then they'd run a small piece to the north from two sides, and then the line would go, then they'd build a line further on going north and stuff. But this, on some small places, they had this little rig, and the only thing they had to turn around was the engine. The railroad cars could go either way, and so occasionally you'd find places where they had this rig, and then they'd put the engine on it, and then they'd swing it around so it would be going the other way, and then they'd get them moving. Now here shows, it's not real clear, but you can just see, you see this piece of swamp with a little piece of water, and then just behind it, you can see a Y where the line going to the top of the picture and is coming off of the main line, which is to the south here, to the south of it a little bit. Now, back in them days, early on, they often just used, especially company camps that often just used firewood. They had all kinds of wood along the grades that wasn't any good for logs, like balsam and some of the stuff that couldn't use. But there were some camps, now some of these are from Presque Isle, but a lot of them aren't necessarily from Presque Isle, where they'd haul in coal to get the steam engine going. Now, there were some places where they, even up here in Presque Isle, where they maybe had logs on the other side of the lake that they'd float them over to the wherever the railroad was, and then they had an endless chain that you could just barely see it going up to the top there, where they'd push the logs onto it. The same thing was at the mills. When they had a mill, they'd have one of these chains, and that would pull the log up to the second floor of the mill, and then it was sawed into lumber, and then gravity would get the boards down to the planing part, and when they had the other things going. Now here's a camp that after they got rails in, they could also, instead of, in the early days, they made all the logging camps out of logs, and they'd build whatever buildings they needed, a cook shanty and a bunkhouse and a blacksmith shop and stuff like that. But here is where there was a mill owned it, and probably is the way it worked here at Presque